Hi, everyone. Thank you again for being here in the second session of our panel. This panel is the panel called the Capacity to Transfer the Role of Individuals, Organizations, and Systems on the Adoption and Internationalization of Public Policies. In this session, I'm going to be the moderator, and we are going to have Natalia Koga from the Institute for Applied Economic Research, IPEA, who is going to be discussing the papers. We have three papers that are going to be presented today. The first paper is a paper that's going to be presented by Olivier May. It's called Knowledge Battles at the World Bank, How Institutional Activists Introduced the Norm of Participation into International Development Policy. And the second paper is a paper produced by Natalia and me, which is called the Policy Transfer and State Capacity, an Introduction. What we are doing here is basically developing a framework of analysis to understand the role of policy capacity in policy transfer. We are going to have more time to discuss about this later. And the third paper is a paper prepared by Barbara Maia Lima Madeira Pontes from the Institute of Political Science at the University of Brasilia. Her paper is called Will or Obligation, Policy Transfer and the Role of World Bank in the Case of RN Sustentável. So just a few comments on the technical aspects of this panel, this session. So every participant will have from 15 to 20 minutes to make the presentation. We are going to have all the presentations, and then we are going to have a round of comments. And the comments are going to be made by Natalia, as I mentioned. And then also all the people who are in the audience can make questions or comments to the papers presented by the authors. To make your questions, you can use the YouTube chat here and just write down, and I'm going to read the questions to all the participants. So before inviting Olivier to talk, I'm just going to say a few words about this panel. This is something that Natalia and I have been discussing about policy capacity and policy transfer. Policy capacity is the area of expertise of Natalia, and policy transfer is my area of expertise. And since the past conference on policy diffusion and development cooperation held here in São Paulo in 2018, we started this dialogue. We understood that there was not much said yet, or there was not a lot of studies dealing specifically with the role, the impact of policy capacity in policy transfers. So we started to discuss what are the role of capacity of agents to export policies, as well as the role of agents, state level agents, to localize and nationalize global public policies, such as the Sustainable Development Goals or other global agendas. We wanted with this panel to move further in our discussion. And for this reason, we included it in the call for papers. We had a first session previously that was very inspiring, and we were able to discuss different aspects of policy transfer and state capacities as the role of obstacles to cooperation in policy transfer, the role of civil society organizations in state capacity, in policy transfers and state capacity, and also the impact of states on modernizing their governments and their relationship with state capacity. So this is where our discussion is moving. And with now no further delay, I would like to invite our first presenter, Professor Olivier Ney, from the University of Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne, to present his paper. So, Olivier, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Sorry, I did not unmute. Okay, thank you very much. I'm so glad to participate in this second international conference on policy diffusion. That's my second participation, and I'm still very happy to interact with you all. I present today a paper called "Knowledge Battles at the World Bank," which tries to focus on the role of institutional activists who played a role in the rise of the concept of the norm of participation in the international development policy discourse. And this paper falls into policy diffusion studies as it focuses on the rise and the circulation of the issue of participatory development, especially in the world of specialized international organizations, those organizations that lead programs on development in the global south. And the main research question I try to focus on is to understand why and how the issue of participation initially gained traction within the World Bank. The World Bank was one of the first organizations of the international bodies to buy participatory approaches in its own agenda. And I thought it would be interesting to understand how this organization imported the concepts of participation and transformed it into a norm. When we talk here about participatory development, it's both a concept, a theory, a set of representations and beliefs on the need to engage local populations and also civil society organizations and citizens in development projects. And since now the mid-90s, the late 90s, the concept of participation is one of the key mantras in the development community. But I try to focus on the period of the 80s and 90s when the concept was still ignored by the mainstream discourse in international organizations. And I do focus on the period of inception, when the concept appeared in the early 80s and got traction in the late 80s, early 90s. This concept was, as I said, ignored by most of the economists who were building the dominant paradigm of the World Bank. And as you remember, at that time, they were supporting market-oriented macroeconomics, supported by the US government in the context of structural adjustment plans. So the issue of participations was at that time only supported by a bunch of progressive experts convinced that there was a need to protect poor population from the big projects, the big loan projects set in place by the World Bank. So from a theoretical standpoint, I think that my paper perfectly fits into the issue of the day, as I try to embrace the three levels of that you mentioned in the title of this working group: individuals, organization, and system. At the micro level, I try to explore the role of the entrepreneurial role of individual staff members, and I do focus on the role of insiders, staff members from the World Bank, including researchers and a few decision makers who embraced participatory approaches and supported them. But I also pay attention to some outsiders who were part of the networks of the network of the insiders, including some academics who were enrolled in discussion on participation and gave some legitimacy to the notion. I try also to focus on the concept on the level of the organization in itself, the World Bank. I pay attention on the internal activities of the bank, including the role of the staff units, the competition between the departments, the interest of the professional groups and communities. What I want to say here that I consider that the bank is a social world in itself that matters when it comes to understand how concepts circulate in the international arena. I consider that international organizations cannot be considered as empty shells, even if they are highly dependent on governments, if they have weak legitimacy, if they have sometimes poor resources, which is not the case of the World Bank, of course. But I try to show that these organizations are vast bureaucratic structures with multiple internal units, structures, staff groups, with various backgrounds, views, interests, and we cannot ignore what happens inside organizations if we want to understand how knowledge, norms, ideas, policy products circulate from one organization to the other, from one field to the other, or from the international realm to the national scenes. And I strongly advocate that we should, and that's what I try to do, use some concepts and tools from the sociology of organizations or the sociology of institutions. Sociology was widely ignored by international relation approaches for a long time, and it's good that now we have this opportunity to explore these organizations with sociological tools. And I try to also to embrace the last level, the macro level, when I focus also on what I call the ecosystem of the World Bank, which is the environment of interconnected institutions and professional ecologies. So the empirical, when it comes to the empirical analysis, I try to lead on the rise of participatory approaches. I divided my demonstration, my reasoning into 3 parts, each part focusing on a specific question. The first focuses on the global context, and especially in the 80s on the pressures that were coming from NGOs and advocacy actors to support participation as a new idea, a brand new idea to involve local population into their future, into the development project that were led by international organizations, including the World Bank. And these activist movements were pressurizing more and more international institutions, especially the World Bank, trying to bring the legacy of the tradition, opened by Paulo Freire, a very famous Brazilian theorist on education. And this activist movement mostly were from supporting either the environment. They were environment organization, environmentalists, but they were supporting the idea that population should be involved for one main reason. The World Bank led a lot of loan projects that resulted in the violation of human rights of local population especially when the World Bank led some infrastructures project, irrigation project. There were multiple forced displacement and violations of human rights, and participation was considered by the NGOs as a way to stop these problems, to force engineers, financial operators, and local government to bring on board local population for their own right to be protected. The second section of the paper is the most important one. I try to concentrate on the internal activities of the World Bank, especially on the role of some individuals that I call institutional activists. There are various ways to name those individual actors who contribute to policy diffusion: knowledge brokers, knowledge entrepreneurs, policy ambassadors, policy advocates. But I prefer here institutional activists, as I focus on contention and disputes between the various groups inside the bank. And I focus on the active role of some knowledge brokers who support some disruptive views. Participation was a disruptive view. It was heterodoxy in face of the dominant paradigm supported by the mainstream economists. And I try to show that inside the bank there were some staff members who decided to champion global causes inside the bank, especially the concept of participation. And inside the bank, that was the role of the researchers in social science. They played a major action, especially the anthropologists of the bank, under the leadership of one researcher called Michael Cernea. They decided openly to import new ideas on the inclusion of the poor in project development, and they built a coalition with external actors, including some progressive academics and experts who were convinced that that was the way to move forward in the field of development. And then I move in the 90s when I examined a group of social reformists who took over the promotion of participatory ideas internally. And these social reformists some of them were decision makers, managers. They decided to disseminate the idea of participation within the bank. And I focus on one person who is part of the elite and played as an entrepreneur, what Sidney Taro called sympathetic elites. He means by sympathetic elites some decision makers that have close relationships with NGO activists, with grassroots organizations, and try to take over their cause inside a government organization. And that was very important in the early 90s to understand why participation became a new idea inside the bank, even if the economists were reluctant to move forward. The last part of the paper focused on the ability of all these insiders, what we could call insider activists, to build some connections and some alliances with some allies outside the organization. Because, when you're in insider, you have poor resources internally, you remain a minority. You strive to enroll renowned academics, intellectuals, with a view to advance your own points and to give more legitimacy. And at that time, two very famous, renowned political scientists found a place at the World Bank and participated in policy framing. Mancur Olson, who is a very famous economist and political scientist who work on social mobilizations, and Robert Putnam, who is one of the most renowned political scientists. He was writing at that time the book Bowling Alone, and he used the World Bank as a place to promote his ideas on social capital. And that paved the way for the intellectuals of the bank, for the decision makers, to reframe the notion of participation through the concept of social capital, which became very popular in the discourse of the bank and very compatible with the discourse of the economists. And that's why and how participation became part of the discourse of the bank. In another paper, I try to show the late period sequence of the circulation of the concept of participation. I do not do it in this paper. And in another paper, I try to show how the expert of the bank twisted, distorted, and rebuilt the concept of participation to insert it into the global governance discourse. But I'm not doing this in this paper. I would like to conclude with 4 very quick conclusion, if I have 2 minutes. One, first conclusion, I want to I try to say in the paper that the incorporation of a concept, of a norm, like participation, cannot be reduced to a cultural process. We need to enter the organization and to see the transactions, the exchanges between individuals, groups, segments, and units of the organizations. Second, I try to show that while a concept, a notion like participation is circulating inside the organization, it is subject to knowledge battles between the groups competing for influence. And at that time, the 2 groups competing for influence were some social scientists allied with some decision makers promoting the concept of participation as a disruptive idea, and some other, mostly orthodox economists, resisting and circumventing the concept, trying to preserve the prevailing paradigm of the bank, which was the structural adjustment plans. Third conclusion, the paper argues that these conceptual battles transcend the boundaries of the organizations. As I said, there were some connections, some alliances between some insiders and some outsiders, and we need to understand the personal networks, the professional ecology, the institutional ties between the inside and the outside, if we want to understand the circulation of the concept inside the bank. The fourth and last conclusion, and I will conclude by this, I try to show that the concepts always undergo multiple reinterpretations, multiple adaptations, as they are subject to internal knowledge building activities. This is something that most scholars working on policy diffusions know. Ideas have a social life. They circulate, and while they circulate, they endure successive reframing processes. They are reshaped, and in this case of the World Bank, what we can observe is that the concept of participation entered the bank as a social notion, promoting the right of the local populations. After a few years, it became, through reforming processes, a conception of governance, and started to concentrate on efficiency for better policy results, on institutions rather than on the local population. These are the 4 conclusions I tried to make, and I think that's all, folks, and I wait for your comments and critics. If you have, I would be very happy to interact with you in a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olivier, for this very nice presentation about the World Bank and the participatory agenda inside the bank. I'm going to move now straight forward to the second presentation, which is my presentation with Natalia, and later we can discuss all the 3 presentations. So we are going to present this together, Natalia and myself. We divided our presentation. I think Miwa, can you put our PowerPoint? I'm not sure if it's on. Okay, good. So we changed a little bit the title of our presentation related to what is shown in the program. So we're calling this policy transfer capacity, the role of individuals, organizations, and systems on the adoption and internationalization of public policies. And what we are going to do now is that we are discussing our main concept of policy transfer capacity. Next slide, please. Okay, and we are going to discuss the main purposes of this paper. We are going to do a very quick literature review on policy transfer and policy capacity in order to present our argument. And then we're going to present to you, outline our proposal to the discussion on the capacity to transfer. And finally, we are going to discuss our final considerations. So the main purpose of this paper, next slide. So we have, Natalia and I, as I mentioned previously, we have been discussing about these two emerging dynamics of policy transfer. The first one is the progressive engagement of states in the internationalization of domestic policies, either via international cooperation or when it's related to national policies, and to paradiplomacy when it's related to subnational policies. Governments have been trying to have a sort of a mark on their certain policies, doing also international marketing and branding their domestic policies. And this is a feature that in order to be operated requires some capacities, state capacities. On the other hand, we have a lot of different demands related to global public policies, demands for states to implement new practices as the 2030 agenda, for example, or with the Sustainable Development Goals, or the new urban agenda, and so on and so on. So governments, both national and subnational, are more often required to nationalize or localize such policies. So we understood that there is a lack of the debate of the micro dynamics of the state capacities operating in policy transfers. And we wanted to advance a sort of conceptual framework or conceptual discussion about this topic. In this paper, we are going to focus in three main elements. What is the capacity to transfer, either import or export? How state brokers influence policy transfers? And when policy capacity is determinant for policy transfer to success or to failure. Obviously, we have here a sort of parti pris for the capacity to transfer policies, but there is also an important dimension of policy capacity, which has been also highlighted in different papers here in these conferences, and especially in the debates in panel, I think it's panel 14, coordinated by Juliana Costa, that are related to the place of capacity in capacity development in South-South cooperation. And this is a different way of looking to these literatures together, which we are not going to consider here, but a lot of actions on development cooperation it's about transferring the capacity to do policy elsewhere. So next, please. So our work is mostly about mostly theoretically. As I mentioned, we are comparing this, preparing this framework. And we wanted to present a sort of balanced outline of both literature on policy transfer and state capacity before advancing on our framework. I'm going to be really quick on this because it's a diffusion transfer conference, and I don't want to take much time about this literature review, but we acknowledge that there are 3 different streams of research to understand how policy travels: policy transfer, diffusion, circulation, and mobilities. And we wanted to introduce a few questions that are useful for us to develop our framework. So these questions are present in the literature and have been helping scholars to understand how policy travels. And the questions are the following. So what is transferred? We can have here different types of policy instruments that are transferred from one place to another. Who is involved in these processes as different agents that can be bureaucrats, both domestic and transnational bureaucrats, or other categories, as Olivier mentioned previously, individuals, different types of individuals that can be his activists, or the policy ambassadors, or other elites, and so on and so on. Where the transfer is taken from where to where, what is the degree of the transfer, and which forces constrain or facilitate this operation. And here we can open also a discussion with the causal mechanisms that are present in the literature: coercion, learning, competition, and emulation. But also we can open a discussion which is really underdeveloped in the literature, which is what elements constrains policy transfer, which can lead us to the idea of the fact of the lack of state capacity can constrain a policy transfer. Finally, we have another question which is related to translation. So how policies are translated, how they are adapted and adjusted by the different agents that are operating the transfers, but also how policies are translated in order to meet contextual dimensions, contextual impositions, cultural impositions from the place where these policies are being adopted. And this is related to the plasticity of policy models, or what Olivier just called the life cycle or social life of a public policy. So next, please. So the policy transfer literature have advanced a lot in so many fronts of research. Just to outline briefly a few that are interesting for us: the role of individuals, the human agency in policy transfer, but also the role of the state and the international organizations. For example, the OECD as a knowledge agent, as Leslie Powell's research show, or the World Bank as a globalizer, as Olivier just showed us in his presentation. But also we have a lot of advancement in the impact of non-state agents, such as think tanks, private organizations, and the interdependence of these organizations. We have also discussed a lot in the literature the role of epistemic community, instrument constituencies, event institutional activists, all this, the analysis of groups in policy transfer, and also the political dimension, the dimension of the different forces that can foster policy transfers. So I will stop here and then invite Natalia to join us and present a first outline of policy capacity literature.
Thank you, Osmani. Next slide, please. So very briefly, guys, I would like to say, well, a few words on how this literature developed throughout the decades. We can say that it started from a movement in mostly the institutional and also the political science literature in trying to return to be interested in the role of the state and the performance of the state after a period of very great focus on the actors that actually constrain or control the state action. That is part of the participatory literature, as Olivier was showing to us. And from that moment, this concept of capacity, state capacity mostly, start to be used to engage with different meanings and different applications. So to give you some examples, it started to be used to try to understand the state formation, the different stages of economic development, the effective state intervention in the economy, the state embeddedness in social structures, and then started to move to more, I would say, meso-micro levels in terms of trying to understand the or state organizations dynamics in subjects such as administrative reforms and innovation, and finally, how capacity affect public policy as a condition or as an outcome of public policy. So next slide, please. So we are starting from this point, more specifically from the literature of policy capacity in terms of, well, our environment of interest will be the policy in itself. And these, the authors from this field, in our view, they contribute a lot in bringing again the unity of analysis as a unit of analysis the individuals, and also the organizations in terms of looking at their skill, resources, and capabilities in the policy process, the policy making. Yeah. And they also contribute in terms of the kind of dimensions that were usually looked at the state capacity literature. They bring another element, that's what they call the analytical capacity in policy making. That actually is this prospecting, selecting, translating, producing, disseminating relevant information and knowledge for policymaking, something very important in the transfer literature. So this is we saw as a relevant linkage that we can contribute in bringing these two literature together. And more recently, some works that have been developed trying to understand capacity in context of increasing complex situations like the COVID-19. And we have some recent works from Capano and Mazzucato and Cattell that also highlights the relevance of the states and the organizations to adapt and to learn properly and dynamically, what they are calling dynamic capacities. That again, we believe some kind of linkage that we can make with the transfer literature. So next slide, please. But despite of all these good aspects of the capacity concept, we also wanted to point out some kind of limitations and warnings that we have to make when we use this concept and we try to operationalize it in empirical works. Yeah. And if on the one hand, the malleability is a good thing coming from the capacity concept because it can be used in different contexts, as we mentioned before, it can also produce tautological or circular explanations. Why? As we have discussed in this section before, and I think Anna has synthesized very well this idea, we can use capacity even as a condition or as an outcome, a mean or a result of some transfer process in our specific discussion. So it's very important when we decided to use that we state right in the beginning that we are using for this or that purpose, yeah? Otherwise, as I've mentioned, circular explanations will be like, okay, capacity contributes to development and development produce capacity and we don't move from there, no? Another important limitation as well, and maybe this is a very interesting another relationship that we can make with the transfer literature, is that capacity is actually a static resource, is a latent concept. So, and there's something, a big challenge in this literature is to understand how actually we can mobilize capacity, or what kind of factors mobilize capacity. And when I was reading all the papers of our session, that's something that came up in my mind, that, well, transfer is actually discussing agency, and capacity is discussing structural conditions. So maybe it's another point that we can develop from there in both literatures. Next slide, please. So finally, what we are proposing in this first initial debate that we could understood as capacity to transfer, and we are inspired here by Wu, Ramesh, and Howlett's definition for policy capacity, and understand that capacity transfer can be defined as the set of skills and resources or competences and capabilities necessary to perform a movement in time or space of policy objects. By means of that, we understand that capacity transfer can be used both from the idea of an outcome or a condition for the transfer process, despite of the fact, as Osmani has mentioned before, that we are focusing in this paper more in the idea of capacity as a condition. But it can also see that it can be useful from the perspective of who import and from who export as well, from both sides. We look at it, and this is advancement that I believe that we can make from the transfer discussion, that we can move from the idea of capacity only within state agencies, and to broaden it in order to understand the capacities of non-governmental, international, private think tanks, other types of organizations involved in the transfer process. And we also do not localize these capacities only in transnational or national level. We believe that can be applied in different levels of analysis as well. So next one, please. This is just a figure to allow you to give you an idea, if you are not aware of this analytical framework proposed for Wu, Howlett, and Ramesh. They understand that capacity can be understood as, again, Olivier has already very properly mentioned, in individual, organization, and systemic levels. And they highlight these dimensions of capacity of the analytical one, as I've mentioned before, the operational and political one. And we will start in the next slides to discuss each of them. Next one. In terms of the analytical transfer capacity, we can say that it is referring to the skills, resources, and capabilities to acquire, produce, reflect, and apply knowledge for the transfer process. So we can have analytical capacity not only in the organizational level, but also in the individual level or systemic level. For instance, individual level, we are talking about the ability of individuals of working to produce sound analysis to inform transfer process. In the organizational level would be the machinery to collect and process information within the organization. In the systemic level, we are talking about the educational facilities in a society which allows policymakers and workers to access high quality information and carry on with their analysis. So in the case of the transfer process, the individual analytical capacity will be, for instance, the knowledge and skills on project design and management, on different cultural of international cooperation, on territory variety, diversity. In the organization, one could be training systems, machinery and process for collecting and analyzing relevant data and to promote dialogue between the different actors, to be able to conduct some kind of forums of conference, international dialogue. In the systemic level, we'll discuss like the educational system of public policy training in the whole environment where the policy transfer occur. I would like to head over to Osmani to talk about the operational transfer capacity and political transfer, and to wrap up our presentation. So because he can give you best examples on the transfer field as well. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Natalia. So continuing, can you please move to the next slide? Yeah, so we're continuing with the operational transfer capacity, which is related to the skills, resources, and capabilities to operate in the transfer process. Again, we were very much inspired by the Wu, Howlett, and Hamish framework in order to develop this, and we applied these ideas to empirical evidence and literature from policy transfer. So we are looking to this when we discuss the individual operational transfer capacity. We are thinking about the skills and knowledge to perform the transfer process and use tools. And we are specifically thinking about the expertise in building and maintaining information systems, expertise in finding financial support for projects, fundraising from the private sectors or NGOs. We are also thinking about the practical and technical knowledge to operate internal infrastructure of the policy transfer. We understand that practical knowledge is something that can allows policymakers to navigate more fluidly into policy transfer operations, insofar as they can know shortcuts in the institutional, bureaucratic, and political systems. When we are discussing the organizational dimension, we're thinking about structured process and tools, including coordination, and this is related to the availability of personnel and personnel resources, standardization of process and manuals on cooperation for or development cooperation, instruments, what we call instruments for policy transfers, that is those agreements, protocols, treaties, funds, and other tools that are specifically designed to exchange policies. We're also interested on the data and registries of field missions. We think that this specifically can be important to make processes smoother, as well as to find information, find the right person to contact, the right staff in order to prepare or develop a project. Finally, on the systemic dimension, we are thinking about those efforts to address collective problems, and can be very complex. We are thinking about the system coordination or of a national ecosystem for development cooperation, or international relations offices or bodies in the ministries, cities, state agencies, and so on and so on. And the examples of this can be the offices in the ministries of social affairs, as well as international relations offices in the state governments or cities that can support this the coordination and be able to achieve these collective efforts to address problems. And finally, next, please, next slide. The political transfer capacity. So this is the political dimension of policy transfer was sort of overlooked in the first studies. And this is a very important skill in order to operate transfer, to achieve, to accomplish policy transfers. So we are thinking here on the skills, resources, and capabilities to build political will and influence. When we are thinking on the individual dimensions, so we are discussing the skills to navigate to the political realm, both domestic and transnationally. And we think that first, leadership can be an important element. So leadership of championing a policy model. This can be inside a state, but also in an international organization. We had a previous in the previous panel discussion about how a ministry of foreign relations was responsible, was the main figure in order to adopt the Bologna education system in Kazakhstan. The paper of Arai was very interesting on this, but also Olivier was discussing this on the role of the champions of participation in the World Bank. Also, political will is very important, even if this is a very complex concept to discuss. We need authorities intending to embrace policy transfers. They can facilitate this process, as for example, the nationalization or the adoption of the different protocols that were presented by the World Health Organization to fight against COVID. So in some countries, we noticed that there was a lack of political will towards the adoption of such measures. Meanwhile, in others, there was an embracement of this. And so political will can be very important in order for policy transfers to be accomplished. Political support, the capacity of persuasion, that is to convince that the model is good, including for party members or for civil society or for the public opinion, and so on and so on. Political knowledge and power, both personal and collective power. On the second element here, we have organizations, which we are related to the resource to build international cohesion and to mobilize and create channels of communication with other agents involved in the transfer process. We are just thinking here about the legitimacy and the dialogue with civil society, but also of bureaucratic support. So often councils or channels of consultation, participation, deliberation of civil society in public policy making process can be important. And finally, on the systemic dimension, we understand that it's shaped by the level of trust in the political, social, economic, and security spheres of public action. And here we are thinking again on political accountability, in trust in the political, economic, security spheres. So how we can, the governments or international organizations build this trust into public policies or the establishment. For example, again, to use the example of COVID, now we are witnessing campaign, very strong campaign of people incentivizing and encouraging the population to take the vaccine because part of the population is not convinced yet of taking it. So a policy of immunization is requiring this trust and accountability in order to be better accomplished. And I'm going to move to the final considerations. I know we took much longer than expected, and apologies for that. The next slide, please. So just to wrap up, we wanted to reflect upon the possible interlaces between transfer and capacity literatures. Capacity concept is latent in nature, and transfers concept is a type of an action process of phenomenon. And we of course, this is a very exploratory framework, and we are welcoming your comments on what we are presenting here in order for us to develop even more this analytical tool. So this is it. Thank you very much for your attention, and apologies for taking so long. Thank you. Okay, so me again. We can hand over to Barbara's presentation. Barbara, please feel free to start whenever you're ready. I'm going to inform you that when we will you have 5 minutes. Okay.
So, hello everyone. I'm going to share a brief, hopefully, presentation here. So my work here today is actually part of my master's research. I have already finished it, but I'm trying to bring it up here to hear your considerations. I'm doing a case study from a policy that's being developed in Rio Grande do Norte, a state, a Brazilian state in northeast Brazil, and it's an agreement of the state government with the World Bank. So the objective of this paper is to analyze the policy transfer process based on the case of rede sustentável in Rio Grande do Norte. Is there a coercive process when analyzing policy programs from the World Bank adopted by local governments? That specific question emerged when I was working with actors in the field, working with bureaucrats and beneficiaries of the program. Most of the times, those actors, they would point out to me that the presence of the bank was coercive. And I was trying to figure out, is that really the case? And Rio Grande do Norte was chosen because it represents a typical case. It is a northeastern of Brazil state. Most of Brazilian states have right now loan agreements with the World Bank, and the Northeast region itself has a tradition with those kinds of loans, as we're going to talk about a little more later about the program. So, a rede sustentável is also chosen because of the scope of the program. It calls for attention. No one has studied it yet. And it's not only innovative policy for the state of Rio Grande do Norte, but also for the World Bank. The bank has already had some other kinds of programs that are multi-sector, but the rede sustentável is the first one that is so big, both in their goals and the participation of many secretariats of the state government. So I think it's an interesting case for us to analyze and to think about these processes, this transfer process and the relationships that the actors build there. So the methodology I used was a qualitative and exploratory research. The main research analysis made here was content analysis of interviews and documents. So I proceed to interview with key actors of the process of formulation and implementation of a rede sustentável. And those key actors were firstly identified in the documents of the program. So we had a lot of people interviewed that were pretty involved in the implementation. They were in the management unit of the program, but also members of the governor's cabinet, of chief of staff, and beneficiaries of the program, people that worked for the World Bank, and state legislative people. So that bring me with 11 interviews in person and or by email. Some of the actors couldn't be present. That was the person I interviewed from the World Bank, and others wanted to tell me things other than in person. So I sent them emails, and that was my data to analyze. So a rede sustentável case analysis is a RENE. It's a small state in Northeast Brazil, and we have a history of contracting loans with the World Bank. And the presence of the World Bank in the Brazilian Northeast is pretty significant. At least since all states in the Brazilian Northeast have a constant presence of the World Bank, especially after the reformulation of the development strategy of the bank for the Brazilian Northeast. And now we have two lines of action, which are community development and poverty alleviation. But for Brazil specifically and the Brazilian states, the 1990s is a significant decade, that's when a new stage of the relationships between the bank and the country's state governments begins. Because until 1993, the union was the exclusive borrower from the loans, and after these years, it becomes only the guarantor of the loans. So the possibility that comes here is that each state or municipality individually can request loans from the World Bank, and that opens for us a range of possibilities to analyze how the transfer of ideas and models and policies developed here in Brazil, especially in subnational context. So in the RN's case, we can see the presence of the bank at least since 1970s with rural poverty reduction program, and other investments have been made along the time. We have a lot of programs based on poverty reduction, infrastructure, and especially on water resource management, which are still enacting till today. And we have three main programs that have been developed by the bank in RN, which are in 1997 and 2002, the two programs that combat rural poverty. And in 2011, when the PCPR2 ends, we have RN Sustentável. It happens in parallel with other projects, but as I mentioned it earlier, the scope of this program is much bigger than the other experiences. So it's a little interesting to try to bring up some of the political context that inspired the program to its existence. We have three governments already happening while the program is being implemented: the Rosalba Ciarline government, Robson Faria government, and the current government, which is Fátima Bezerra. And those governments are important for two reasons. First, the Ciarline government, it's when the project is being developed and when it's born. One of the actors used this phrase that the Ciarline government prepared the ground bureaucratically and technically for the approval of the program. So one of the first things Rosalba Ciarline does when she goes into her government is to sign the loan with the World Bank. That's pretty representative. She actually takes charge of the government in January. In approximately March, she's already in Washington talking to the bank people. And that's the main goal for her in her government. And that made her have an effort to approve the loan in the state, national, and international level. Not only she prepare the whole government to receive the loan, since the bank imposes some conditionalities to the approval of the loan, but nationally we have to pass the loan because the federal government is the guarantor of the loan. And in the state level, the legislative assembly needs to approve it as well. That made her have all those efforts in the political arena. And one other thing that I find it really interesting in her government and in this process of preparing the ground is the presence of this lady, which is called Fátima Amazonas. Fátima Amazonas is a senior rural development specialist, and she is a well-known actor in the country as an expert that helps to promote the World Bank proposals. She's not only known by the government people, she is known for most of the actors I interviewed. She's a name repeatedly brought up to me by the actors, not only in the context of RN Sustentável, but also in other projects that were developed in Rio Grande do Norte and in other states of the region and of Brazil. So the other government, because the RN Sustentável project actually only began its implementation in December 2013. So we have another governor that takes the office in 2015, and he makes some changes in the project. And that's also interesting in a political point of view, because we can see the way different governments have different agendas and different goals, and how they can adapt the program, even though it's along with conditionality with the World Bank. It's interesting, Robson Faria even changes the name of the program. From his administration on, the program stops being called RN Sustentável, it starts being called Governo Cidadão. The reason I didn't change the name of the program in my presentation is because even the website of the program remains called RN Sustentável. So I think that's a little interesting in a political point of view, because it shows that Robson Faria was trying to take over the program as one of his ideas, one of his proposals in his governmentship. So talking a little about RN Sustentável, as I mentioned it earlier, it has a multi-sector character, and it's something that was never done before in the state, but also, as I mentioned, it hadn't been done yet by the World Bank. It innovates as it is dedicated to a remodeling in governance, so it's an important aspect of the program, and it drives a change in the administrative apparatus in favor of management by results. That's something we all also heard in all the presentations today, which I find interesting to notice. It is an extensive public policy. It covers all the 10 territories of the state. Also, it connects to another policy of the federal government, the policy of territories. And from a managerial and personal point of view, also, we have all the secretariats involved. And the project has 3 main goals, and it shows how big it is. It focuses on regional development, improvement of public services, health, education, and public security, and improvement of public sector management, which we understand is governance. That's also one of the criticisms of the program, because we have a lot of things trying to be done with that amount of money. And at the same time that we have the construction of schools, of hospitals, and of productions, we have agricultural fairs, we have investments on bands, on state orchestras, and there's a lot being done with that money, and sometimes that's hard to notice, even for the actors I interviewed, how this money is being applied, and what that money can actually mean for the development of the state. So what we tried to do here was take and categorize each of the interviews and other documents from the program. And I worked with the 4 categories of the mechanism in action. And each category each phrase could only be applied to one category. And then that made me have those categories and those quotations. So learning category was the one with the most quotation by our actors, which in my opinion means that there is a good amount of believing in the learning process happening here. So in the coercion point of view, what we can observe is it is little or inexpressive. Most of the actors interviewed, they would talk about the presence of the bank as being a constraining factor. So in the same time that the bank would impose some rules for the actions of the people working in the project, and their presence is really strong in the States. One of the interviewers would say to me that he hadn't been in any meeting that someone of the bank wasn't there. And that's pretty significant to see how those actors are involving in the development of policies. And so in the same manner, we see that the attempts of the bank to impose its model are conditional to the will of the rulers to adhere to the proposals and that's what prevails in decision making. Even if the bank has some power to make adaptations to the programs that are being developed, the political will and the bureaucratic capacity seem to have a lot more weight. So in general, what we see that the bank's most intensive way to spreading its models, its intense presence in the state. And so this coercion is viewed more like how the bank can make the governments apply to their ideas. And here's a quotation from interviewee H, and she's saying that the World Bank has a long-standing partnership with the Northeast region and the state of Rio Grande do Norte, with regular dialogues and an overall leading program, sector strategies, and state-specific operations. Throughout the negotiation of the consultation letter with the federal government and project design and law agreement, the World Bank actively participated in the process, making its expertise available to state teams. So the bank actually starts to acting more influencing the government than coercive in a way of resources or other kinds of typical coercions. When we talk about emulation, we see that it was the government that took the initiative to seek contact with the bank, and it joins with other state governors of the Northeast of Brazil and meeting with the bank's president. But we also see that the project wasn't necessarily a well-thought or established policy, being in fact seen only as a solution of the problem of lacks of resources for investments in the state. So when Rosalba is elected, the state is going through a difficult economic phase. We have a lot of problems balancing our economic status. And so the first thing she sees is, I will take a loan. And that will allow us to have investments and money for investments in the state. One of the actors pointed out to me that it seems like if she's looking to past governments and saying, well, that worked for them, so it's going to work for me. And it's like, it's a way of doing things in here. Like governors see that the state is having trouble with investment, so they are going to seek the World Bank to make a loan. As we also see that there is a process of adaptation to the bank's rules. They are trying to seek out the experiences of other states. As I said, the reunion, the meeting with the bank's president was made jointly with governors of the other states. And also we see there are modifications to the design of the policy that the bank brought to the state. So the bureaucratic apparatus and the government, they make some changes to adapt it to local circumstances. And here I also have two of the interviews that I've made that are talking a little about this process. The interviewee Age is also saying that it's often essential to adjust the project, especially to meet new demands. So we see that a lot in this project since it has been going on for a long time. When we talk about competition, we see a little bit of that, especially because we have been seeing that the states of the Northeast region were competing for resources. In here, we have Chief of Staff Paulo de Tasso, he was a chief of staff of Rosalba Serralini's government, talking about the fights for resources from the federal government and talking about how the resources from the project of the World Bank would help in this process. In the same manner, not only they were fighting for the federal government resources, the other states of the region were also applying for loans with the World Bank. So that's an interesting point of view. When we talk about learning in this process, we observe that there is a learning from other loans previously taken. The bureaucratic apparatus, they know how to take loans, they know what must be done and what they need to do. And also politicians of the state know what needs to be done. An interesting aspect of this political setting is that most of the people who are interviewed in the phases of different governments are still in the government apparatus. So even though he was from Rosalba Ciarline government, he is now on Robson Farias government, and that makes me believe that there are these people act as key actors because they have this expertise and this experience with contracting those kinds of loans. So we see that there is a preparation already to apply for these loans, and it seems to me a learning process for the state's governments. We have also thinking about learning capacity for the government, the implementation of new routines. That's something all the actors seem to point out, that for contracting the loan and applying it to the conditionalities imposed by the World Bank, the bureaucratic apparatus had to implement these new routines, and that worked. So we see a change in how the routines are being made in the bureaucratic level of the state government. And also the learning process seems to be having this innovative aspect because it has been changing the way these bureaucratic people see not only the routines, the job routines, the governance aspects of the things, but also how they believe development should happen in Rio Grande do Norte. So I think that this has been some sort of a learning process. To conclude our work here, the state governments of Rio Grande do Norte seem to have a predilection for agreements with the World Bank, and this institution is very effective in disseminating its practices and models to state officials. So the renewal of agreements does not translate into a ipsis literary copy of the model. We see there is an adaptation. Not only Robson Faria changed the name of the program, but he also changed a lot of the agenda of what was being built, of where the investments were going. So the political intent here matters, and matters a lot. Also, one of the people I interviewed were saying that when he was about to finish his term, Robson Faria started to make things even faster for the investments that were being made, because it's a political time. He wanted to be reelected and wanted RN Sustentável to be a bridge for his re-election. So even though the bank is indeed an important actor as a diffuser of models and practice, its performance seems to be conditioned to the state's own will in requesting the loan, and also how the state is going to implement that loan. About a renda sustentável, in spite of the high amount of resources, it's an ambitious number of goals to be reached, and even more, an ambitious amount of political interests involved. And the project seems to be difficult to execute for this design, which is a multi-sectoral design. And the spraying of resources in different areas is a point of concern because we don't see a focused amount of investments. And the impacts of the renda sustentável are still immeasurable. It's difficult to access and to monitor mechanisms. It's difficult to access to monitoring mechanisms, and it's difficult in measuring how small businesses and actions will impact the goals that were set. And to finish some of my research agenda and some of the study limitations, we thought that we would continue this research in a comparative study, thinking about comparing different loans between other Brazilian states and the bank. And also we would like to advance into a research design that could allow us to better measure the mechanisms. Since this was an exploratory research, we were thinking about making a stronger methodology that could help us explain better how these mechanisms are in action in this comparative kind of setting. And also a third goal would be to improve the knowledge about those policy entrepreneurs. Think about Fatima Amazonas that was mentioned so many times. We see that they are key actors in these transferring processes, and how they act could be an important way to understanding better those processes. So here are some references, and thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for this very interesting presentation about the role of the bank in RN Sustentável. It's very interesting because you mentioned a few capacities that I think we also overlooked in our paper, and it would be very nice for us to reflect. For example, the capacity to borrow. I was very impressed about this, and it's something that we should pay attention about when we are studying policy transfers and the relations with agents such as the World Bank. My reading is that from your paper is that we can have at least 3 types of capacity related to borrowing from these institutions. The legal one, as you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation, from 1993, subnational governments started to be able to borrow directly from the bank. Previously, it was the union. Secondly, the political, because you need to get some kind of approval to get the loan made. And also bureaucratic, because as you mentioned in your presentation, you need the staff to know how to perhaps fill the forms or make it the right way in order to prepare a funding demand properly. So this is very interesting. Also, a second element that we kind of overlooked in our framework, and then it's interesting for us to think about, Natalia and I, is this dimension of conditionalities and how this can be related to policy capacities. And the third one, which we have mentioned here again and again, is the role of the champions, the promoters of these World Bank practices, as you mentioned. I think it's Fatima Amazonas, the agent you mentioned, that seems pretty close to what I call policy ambassadors, and very, very nice discussion you had in your paper. So with no further delay, I would like to invite Natalia for her comments, and then we can give back the word for you to reply. If anyone wants to make comments on our papers, because we're not going to discuss our own paper, you are also free to make comments. If you're in the audience and you want to ask questions for Olivier, Barbara, Natalia, and me, please write down your question or comment in the YouTube chat. So thank you very much. I would like to invite Natalia now for her comments.
Hi, thank you very much, Osmani. Thank you very much, Barbara and Olivier. I think I will start with Barbara once. That's the last one, so it's always easier to connect with the comments. Barbara, it was a very interesting paper, and the results were also very, very interesting. And in relation, making connections with what Osmani was pointing out about capacities. In fact, when you give your conclusions in terms of that, what it was important for the transfer, the type of mechanism of transfer to carry on, and you give a very emphasis on the will of the actors. I think you have a lot of evidence in your paper, in your study, that is showing that a lot of the factors that contributed to this process were actually types of capacities, yeah? So I think it was really interesting maybe to advance in the sense that we look at your case, give us material to look at that. on how different mechanisms of learning, competition, coercion, emulation demands different capacities, types of capacities, and levels of capacity as well. What I'm asking here is, for instance, for a coercion relationship, maybe the imbalance of capacity between the who is exporting and who is importing is very huge. While in learning, you have a more equal or balanced capacity relation. So it's something that I would like to invite you to think a bit more in your conclusions, and maybe to add that in your paper. Yeah. So that was, well, make us a lot of thoughts. So to develop in our analytical framework, definitely. And another point that I would like to make is about the empirical work. And I was not sure if you've managed or not to interview the World Bank representative. I understood that yes, but as you said, interviews are coming from the perception of individuals. I understood that you also use documentary analysis, content analysis, but in the empirical work, in the methodology description in your paper, you could give us more detail on how you managed to look at these two types of material, of data in your interpretation. Yeah. And for instance, it was interesting for us to know if the perceptions of the different actors were different or not, if there is some kind of contrasting conclusions on which kind of mechanism they use, and because it depends on from where they're coming from where their capacities are coming from, and the level of these capacities in terms of accumulation. So I would appreciate if you can give us more details on that. And well, I think it's a very, very interesting case to look from the capacity lenses. I'll have other small things to comment, but we really wanted to hear your comments on our analytical framework as well. So I will move to Olivier paper, and I have to say that it was a very, very happy opportunity for me to read it for three main theoretical reasons, I would say. The capacity literature, but also because I'm interested in understanding the evidence-based public policy movement, and I think you have very interesting elements here that we can discuss a little bit more in the future. And also because of the participation literature, yeah, and this question on how the international organizations shaped the ideas of the perception and the understanding of what participation is was very interesting for who is involved in this literature. And unfortunately, I didn't have the contact with your previous work, and I think it's very, very relevant, the developments that you were making. And well, I will start from each part of this kind of analytical lens. In terms of capacity, I think it's very, very interesting. Two main phrases that you give in your paper. One of that is related to that the fact that ideas are not stable during circulation process. And the second one is that what would be the tractions that move ideas? And I think maybe capacity can be part of this, these two, of tractioning and constraining and stabilizing in some level, or being a factor that stabilize how circulation process go on. Because what I want to say is not a new argument, but well, there are preconditions in the environment that any kind of intervention or social phenomenon will occur. So if we understand capacity as the structural conditions that it has been found when the intervention starts, maybe this is the kind of element or factor that constrain the possibility that the traction or the route that the ideas will flow or not. And I found it very interesting and something that can be very, can continue to be elaborated from that. I would like to hear your comments on this idea or this relation that I'm making. The third one, well, your presentation were so clear. We are always learning, and I think you pointed out very clearly the individual, the organizational, and the systemic level. As another question for you, systemic level is all usually for the policy capacity literature the most difficult one to operationalize, because sometimes people understand the systemic as the sum of all the organization and individual's capacity. And I would like to ask you, how was that for you to move from the different levels and to perceive how capacity engage with your case on all these levels? And finally, about capacity, it was a very interesting, I think, invite you to use the capacity terminology to point out all the different aspects of capacity. I could see here when you were presenting in your paper, they can tell the whole story through the capacity lenses. Well, just to give an example, when you were talking about Sarah Gelding involvement in the whole process of putting participation within the World Bank, we see their high-level operational capacity, the educational capacity, the diversity of the teams, how he constitutes a unity over there to improve the understanding, improve or shaping the understanding of participation within the organization the first time. The constitution of monitoring and evaluation tools, and also the engaging aspects of social scientists with the process as well. That lead me to the second analytical lens that's related to the public policy, the evidence-based public policy. It's really interesting how you show in your case how these external allies, the academia, is invited to bring some fundaments in order to that vision to progress within the organization. Well, the role of and the relationship within the bureaucracy of the organization and the academia is another very interesting point here, and I would like to highlight that contribution as well. And finally, for the participation discussion, for me was very, very interesting how you connect that with the two, at least, well, antagonist idea of participation, yes, and this history, that how it started from a social perspective in terms of poor emancipation and moved to a more efficient-based argument, I would say, that I work with this discussion using Chantal's move theoretical debate on agonistic, antagonistic. In my point of view, this social perspective can allows us some conflict to be part of the way that we see participation, the political participation, and while this efficiency kind of view lead us to more a consensus way of seeing participation, and the participation gets to be restricted only to more instrumental kind of contribution in the policy making. But for that, and in your presentation, then I understood that you have a former paper there, and the only suggestion that I have is that from my reading, from you, it jumped from the analysis, and this last contribution from the participatory debate, it comes only in the conclusion, so I didn't understand very well how you connected the two, or how you see the connection between two. Actually, the other paper probably brings all the elements, but you could give just some hints for us, or some part of it, so we can close the chapter. I believe it's already published, I'm not sure, but this paper, the conclusion of this paper in a round way. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much. Looking forward to hearing you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Natalia, for this very insightful comments. We have still 25 minutes to the Olivier and Barbara to reply. I'm not sure if there is any question from the audience. If you have any questions or comments, please write down in the private chat. If Olivier allows me, I think this is the book where your paper was published. It's a book edited by David Dolowitz, Magdalena Hadjiski, and Homo Normand, Shaping Policy Agendas, the Micropolitics of Economic International Organizations. And it was launched a few months ago, and it's available, I think, in Edward Elgar's website. So yes, if you also have comments to our paper, just write down in the chat on YouTube, or if you are if Olivier or Barbara have comments, you can ask us directly. So maybe let's see, 10 maximum 5 to 10 minutes each. We can start from Olivier, following the orders of presentations.
Thank you so much for your comments, Natalia. There are many ones, so it's quite a challenge to respond to all of them in 5 minutes. And I had also some comments on your paper, Osmani, Natalia, and Barbara. So I'll try to let's see what I can say as a response. Just you bring on board the capacity lens and the capacity literature, and I have to say that this just re-question all my research, and it's very impressive how, you know, building a perspective on activism. I had no specific analysis of the issue of the capacity, and I would like now to explore that, especially when it comes to discuss the efficiency of the participatory procedures. You know, as the bank has reframed the notion of participation from a social perspective to an instrumental perspective, of course, most experts bring many arguments regarding the resources, the capacities, the efficiency, the competencies through which we can improve loan projects. And of course, this should be part of the reflection on how the framing of the notion of participation has been done. You mentioned the systemic level also, and how I try to explore this level. Of course, I think, and I advocate for the fact that we need to explore at the same time the individual, the organizational, and the systemic levels. And one way to do it, I don't do it in this paper, but I try to conceptualize that in a book that we just published on international organizations, released last week, where I try to think that we can explore the systemic level around organizations through the notion of ecosystem. So I don't have time to explore that and to build further arguments, but I tried just to focus on professional ecologies around organizations, network analysis, and the institutional perspective, how institutions are connected one to the others. You mentioned the role of evidence-based in the legitimization of new standards, new norms at the World Bank. And you're absolutely right. The World Bank in the early 1990s, especially under the leadership of its new president, James Wolfenson, decided to invest in knowledge and to become a knowledge bank. From that time, that was the case before that time, but the power was in the hands of the engineers in the 70s and 80s. And since the end of the 80s and the early 90s, the economists started to play a key role in the participation in framing the agenda. And like in many organizations, the evidence-based arguments became central, and a lot of battles focused on knowledge, on what was the relevant theoretical approach to development. So I fully agree with what you said. Last point you raised, and you're absolutely right with that. I raised an argument in the end that I'm not really empirically addressed in the content, and you mentioned that it is probably in the other paper, and that's right. Maybe that was wrong that I mentioned the fact that the reframing process and the rise of an instrumental perspective to participation through the notion of global governance or good governance should be more explored in the paper, but the paper was already too long, and unfortunately the editors of the book asked me to cut many parts of it. Very interesting remarks also on Chantal Mouffe perspective on agonistic democracy, and how the question of participation may fuel this agonistic perspective. I think that reframing the notion of participation through the notion of governance, of good governance and efficiency, is a way to deconflictualize the notion of participation. All of you know that international organizations are a place where they try to depoliticize issues, problems, social problems, and the instrumental or technical perspective is a way to bring more technical perspective, whereas the social perspective is more political. I'm going to stop here. I have some remarks on your paper, but I would like to give Barbara a chance to respond.
Hi, thank you for the comments, Natalia. They were really interesting. I haven't actually, when you were presenting, I started to think a lot about the capacities and how that could affect my research and how that connects to my research. So that's something I definitely want to look into. And about the empirical work, yes, you're right. I'm going to rewrite that. And yes, I could interview one of the bank people that were working here. She was one of the chief executives, and I was lucky to interview her. But as you said, that's something that is good to point, that they have different views about the project, because even when she has a critic to make about the bank or the program, it's something really subtle, because she represents the bank in some kind of way. And we have, on the other hand, other actors that are more willing to talk critically about the program, especially those that are connected with the beneficiary. They belong to associations that represent producers of the state, and they are really critical about the program, about the ways that the bank acts. And that's an interesting point to see how those different actors, even though they are connected, they do represent different views about what's going on. And also, people who were in one of the governments, was on the Rosalba government, and then became opposition to her government later. They have different opinions on according to the timeline. So we have people that were with Rosalba when the project started, and then in 2016 they were opposing the program. And that's also something interesting to notice, those kinds of political disputes among the process. And I find it very interesting that both of your papers, they inspired me a lot to rethink about mine. So I want to congratulate all of you, because I now have a lot to think. I think this is it.
I believe that we can head over to Olivier to make comments on the other papers as well.
Yes, thank you. I will be very short. I wanted to just raise one point, one first point, when it comes to study the micro level aspects of policy diffusion and transfer. I would invite you to explore what anthropologists are doing now in studying African societies. In France, we have some anthropologists working on what they call traveling models for development. And they address the question of the localization of policy standards and technologies from the global stage to the local stage in developing societies. I think it would perfectly fit and fuel your research, and also have a circulation, a policy, scientific diffusion between anthropology and political science. I just wanted to raise that point because I think it could be very relevant for the issue of the day. My main comment, and it is on both your paper, and I really appreciate the comprehensive approach that Natalia and Osmani had on policy diffusion and the multiple paths and questions they address. Is quite impressive. It's a bit it brings some anxiety because we have to go. We go in many directions. But I would like to write and to be the devil's advocate, of course, and also advocating against my paper. I think in Barbara's perspective on the four categories she has explored through interviews: learning, emulation, competition, and coercion, as well as the capacity lens to policy transfer, where you mentioned the need to explore the skills, the resources, the capabilities, the competencies of the actors. And those actors may be organizations or individual actors. They may be also think tanks, research institutions, or etc., NGOs. It seems to me that we all insist on the intellectual aspects of policy diffusion. We insist on knowledge building, standard setting, competition, political intentions, will, leadership, learning, emulation. It seems that all the people we talk about understand what they are doing. They know what they need to do. They have some intentions. They make effort to implement their intentions. They try to make agreements. All of them are seen as very rational actors. And I think we think about rationally because people here disseminate some tools, some norms, some concepts, some standards that are highly rationalized. But I can tell you, I worked during 5 years in the United Nations. And there were many ways that through which we were copying other organizations without any intention to do so. I mean, it was pure mimetism, and I would like to refer to the kind of literature in social sciences, which is the neo-institutionalism and the way they address the question of the circulation of routines and models and standards from one organization to the other. They mentioned, the question of the rational choice perspective, but they also insist on the cultural dimension. People copy standards in their environment just because they are prevailing in the environments, and without any rational perspectives behind this. I was struck by the fact that the concept of fragile state could be embraced by all the actors in development without any critical perspective, just because it did exist in the early 2000s. But what struck me is that this concept did not exist 10 years before, and everybody was thinking outside this box. And I was very impressed or struck by the fact that people tend to embrace tools, techniques, knowledge, standards, just because they are prevailing in their environment. And this is what the sociology of institutions call isomorphism. And maybe we should explore a bit more this. I know it doesn't fit into the capacity literature, but it's always, I think, forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivier, for these comments. You are, which are very insightful. Not sure if Natalia wants to react on these comments or Barbara. But yes, and this is very interesting. So first, the comment on the anthropologists and how this traveling models of developments. I think this is a very interesting literature that we should consider in our framework, in our discussions. And the second about this rationality. Yes, sometimes sometimes people are doing routine labor and they copy, mimetize, or try to check the first thing they can see to organize a project and so on and so on. So this is very interesting to maybe take a little bit less of weight in the intentions of the agents, because sometimes things are more spontaneous than a rational project with all the stages and so on and so on. So very good to have to bear this in mind for us. Natalia, would you like to react? Okay.
Yes, I just want to thank you very much for your comments from Barbara and Olivier's, and well, from where you leave us with the anxiety and all the questions. I believe I started to think, well, I wish we could discuss capacity in terms of a post-colonialist perspective or a more post-constructivist perspective, in terms of understanding what other forms of capacity that we are not looking at, and how the powers and the hegemony is also very determinant in the way that capacities can be built and also can be activated. Yeah, and well, we yes, we would like very much to receive reference and then any other comments. But okay. But well, we leave you very happy, huh, Osmani, with this session. Very good papers for us to keep going on working together. And I think Osmani wants to give us an invitation or tell a little bit about possible publications. Is that, Osmani?
Yeah, so I would like to thank all the participants for having joined us on this panel. This is the second session of the policy transfer capacity panel. We had one previously this morning, and we are going to have one later in the day. It's going to be it's going to be at 10 o'clock GMT. We will have a presentation from Aryo Wicaksono from Indonesia and Natalia Poyati from Brazil. So it's going to be live again here in this YouTube channel. And yes, that's it. We are very happy with the contributions. I think we can start advancing more our understanding of these two phenomena put together, policy transfer and state capacities. And I think this is a very rich discussion. So thank you everyone again for being here today. We're closing this panel, and we will join later on. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and activate the notifications in order to be able to receive all the information of the panels when they will be running, and so on and so on. So thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye.